Okay, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening. Welcome from all points of WCS's reign, or north, south, east, and west. I am Heidi Kretzer. I am the director of the Global Rights and Communities team. It is great to see you all here for our field notes from the field, three-part special series on grievance redress mechanism. So what we're going to do is have a little housekeeping here right now. To start out with, we have full interpretation services here today into Spanish and French. So I'm going to share some slides so you can see what to do to log on to interpretation. Hang on just a second while I make that happen. All right. If you want to use the interpretation feature, you will go to the bottom of your Zoom software and click on the interpretation button. And then from the drop-down list, you can select your language. And we recommend that everybody selects a language. Even if you're listening and speaking in English, just click your language. That will improve the sound quality overall. If you are selecting French or Spanish, we recommend that you mute the original audio, which should make it sound a little bit more clear. Okay, there it is. Mute the original audio. Okay, if you have any trouble with the interpretation services, please indicate that in the chat box, and then somebody should be able to assist you. So that's the first bit of housekeeping. And then the second bit of housekeeping is we are trying to record this session. We're recording it in English, but we would also like to record it in Spanish and French. And to do that, we are looking for a volunteer from one of you in the audience. If there is anybody who is listening in Spanish and could record on their personal computer, then send us the link afterwards, that would be fantastic. Similar for French. And I'm just going to ask Dawa to confirm that we need both of them recorded. Is that correct? Is there anybody out there?
Yeah, so we can have one in, I have one in Spanish. We need someone like to record in French. So if you just want to send me a request, I can accept it on my end.
Yes. Is there anybody who could record in French? That would be lovely. Diane.
Hi, sorry I'm late. What do I need to do? How do I do that?
So you can just go to the bottom and then press record, and then the request is going to come to me and I can accept it.
But you have to put the interpretation services into French, so you'll be listening in French.
Right.
Which you may or may not want to do.
Wait.
You could also, yeah. Okay. Well, we'll keep moving forward, and maybe the two of you can sort out in the background the recording in French. Thank you, everybody, for your patience on that. But we would love to make this all available to as many staff around the globe as possible. So carrying on, just so you all know, the recordings will be available after all three presentations are done. We'll have to do a little bit of editing because we will just be recording the presentations, not the discussions before or after. And those will be available on the WCS YouTube channel alongside the recordings from our first Notes from the Field survey that covered the basic necessities survey. So again, welcome to our Notes from the Field on grievance redress mechanisms. As I said, I'm Heidi Kretzer. I'm the Global Director for the Rights and Communities program. I will be moderating today's session alongside Diane Dutouf, who is the Social Science Technical Advisor. Diane's been with WCS for 9 years, 6 in the Congo Basin. She's based in France, and she splits her time between the rights and communities and the conservation technology team, supporting the development of technical and technological solutions for our work with communities. So the two of us will be moderating the discussion at the end of today's session. The installations of Notes from the Field is brought to you by the Global Rights and Communities Program, where we believe that respecting and protecting the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities reflects WCS's commitment to equity and justice and is a necessary pathway to achieve durable conservation. And we do all of this through a human rights-based approach to conservation, in which we work with Indigenous peoples and local communities to secure rights, exercise those rights, benefit from rights in a participatory way that strives for equity, non-discrimination, and accountability. To ensure this is all happening on the ground, a grievance redress mechanism, or a GRM, should be in place to enable us to receive and resolve timely complaints, especially those that are related to infringements on our commitment to a human rights-based approach. So just a little bit of backdrop on GRM at WCS. Prior to 2019, we had only one grievance redress mechanism in operation at WCS. That was the WCS Cambodia program, which we'll be hearing about on December 14th. And then in 2019, as a fallout from the alleged human rights abuses at the World Wildlife Fund and by association other conservation organizations, it became clear that WCS as an organization needed a coordinated approach to GRM. So we have a global GRM policy from 2019, and over the past 4 years, we have been gaining a lot of experience from the trials and tribulations of implementation. And most of this implementation is happening at sites where it's been required by funders, and we haven't had a global rollout yet for all the different sites. But what we're doing in this series today is to take the experiences from this implementation rollout that we've been working on over the last 4 years and provide a series of talks so that you can learn about what works, what doesn't work, where the challenges have been, what the pitfalls are. And our speaker lineup is super exciting. We are starting today with an overview of GRM, where Margit will be giving a talk, and we'll come back to Margit in a second. Then on Thursday, at the same time, we will hear from Manuel from Mozambique and Eduardo from the Amazon Andes Orinoco program. They will be discussing the setting up of a GRM in the context of meeting funder demands and also coordinating with other local NGOs that are working in the area and some of the challenges that that presents. The final day, which is a week from Thursday, includes Pen from Cambodia and Simon from Tanzania to discuss setting up the GRM, where we're working very closely with the government, and the government is insisting on being very involved in the GRM because perhaps they have ultimate control of the project if the money is coming through them and then being given to us. So these are the exciting lineups. We hope you will join all three. We will have interpretation for all three, and all three will be recorded. So without further ado, I would like to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Margit Bertalan is the Regional Social Safeguards Coordinator for the Central Africa and Gulf of Guinea region, based in Kigali. Prior to joining WCS as a Regional Social Safeguards Coordinator, Margit was a consultant for WCS, working on designing grievance redress mechanisms for protected areas. She completed her PhD in ecological anthropology and conducted her PhD research on community perceptions and social impacts of conservation initiatives in Kenya. Margit, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I would like to remind you to speak nice and slowly so that the interpreters can keep up with you and provide interpretation for our colleagues. Thank you so much. And oh, I should say one more thing. If you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat box. Diane and I will keep track of them, and we will bring them up at the end, or at the end, we'll have a free flow discussion where you can come off mute and just ask questions. So Margit, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Heidi. Just want to make sure that everyone can hear me. Thumbs up. Yes. Yes. Okay. I'm going to try and share my screen. We practiced this before. And okay. Can everyone see? I know it's a Google presentation, but you can see it. Great. Okay. Wonderful. All right. So again, yes, thanks everyone for joining. I'm really excited to see so many people on the call. And honestly, I'm quite excited to be presenting on this because I think, as Heidi mentioned, GRM's grievance mechanisms are massively important for the work that we do. And also because I believe that as WCS, we have a really great opportunity to be at the forefront of putting in place a system, a grievance mechanism that is truly accountable and responsive to the needs of the communities where we work. I want to, just as before I dive in, to thank my safeguards and GRM teams in the field in the Central Africa region. They've done a lot of work to get to where we are on what I'm presenting today, and they've also provided some of the content. So a shout out to the Okapi Wildlife Reserve team and the Kahuzi-Biega team. And then one more note, the photographs in this presentation were all taken with consent of the individuals or the parents or guardians of the individuals. All right, so let's dive in. I think many of you, most of you know what a grievance redress mechanism is, or at least have a general idea, and Heidi gave us kind of a brief understanding. I've included a pretty standard definition here so that we can all start on the same page. A GRM, a grievance mechanism, is a transparent and unbiased system where credible grievances are tracked in a confidential, secure database across standardized steps in order to analyze, address, and mitigate or resolve concerns. A GRM enables Indigenous peoples and local communities to submit grievances and seek resolution when they perceive a negative impact arising as a result of an organization's activities. Organization's activities is us, WCS. It's a key way to mitigate, manage, and resolve potential or realized negative impacts and to keep organizations accountable for their actions, inactions, or for the outcomes of their projects. GRM is a social safeguards tool through which IP and LCs can exercise their voices and claim their rights. And to put it quite simply, basically a GRM is a place for people to bring complaints. However, we've been developing a mechanism, as Heidi mentioned, that is really more than just a system for complaints, and I'll get into that a bit here, and also more than just ticking a box for donors. We want something that is a system that's effective and that can help inform our programming, and I hope that I can show that to you today in this presentation.
Margit,
so briefly,
Margit, could you
Yes.
just talk a bit more slowly for the interpreters?
Yes.
Thank
Sure.
you so much.
Sure, sorry. So in the context of conservation, why is a grievance mechanism important? And some of you may have seen this slide before. We've used it in various presentations. A grievance mechanism, it enables communities to connect to us and communicate with us as WCS as a way to share their concerns. It gives communities access to a safe system, a secure system to submit their complaints in a safe way. And it also builds trust between IP and LCs and our work, our staff, our organization, WCS as a whole. And of course, it promotes respect to human rights, and it facilitates or can facilitate, should facilitate gender and inclusion considerations in our programming. Of course, we have our donor obligations, which Heidi also mentioned. This is a very non-exhaustive representation of our donors. These are some of the donors we work with in the Central Africa region. I'm sure those of you on this call have worked with these donors and many others. They all have their own requirements on social safeguards, as well as grievance mechanisms. So I think if you are working in program management or safeguards, of course, or proposal writing and development, you will have noticed that the safeguards requirements are really starting to ramp up, and the requirements for grievance mechanisms are becoming more strict and stringent. But despite donor requirements, WCS, again, we have our own mission and ethics. We claim that the success of our projects depends on how we partner with Indigenous peoples and local communities. We design our activities around how we engage with and work alongside communities and how we are accountable to them and respect them. And there are the international standards when it comes to human rights and safeguards, which we strive to align with and even surpass. And I won't spend much time on this slide because Heidi mentioned it a bit, but this ties to a whole suite of safeguards documents that we have at WCS at the global level. And that includes the Global Human Rights Grievance Redress Mechanism policy that Heidi mentioned. It was developed in 2019. And basically it goes into detail about how a mechanism like this is important to WCS's commitment to ethical conduct, ensuring accountability and responsiveness, to being open to concerns and complaints. The policy, it also details a bit how it's good to have a global policy, but also very important to have site-based mechanisms that are accessible to the direct beneficiaries or stakeholders where we are working. So in the global policy, there's an email, I think there's an address for New York, the New York office, perhaps, and I don't think there's a telephone number, but there's an email and an address to New York, and you can imagine that that's not very accessible to our site-based beneficiaries. And so we're now, as Heidi mentioned, rolling out these mechanisms at our sites that are directly designed for those who are benefiting or may be impacted by our projects at the site level. And I think maybe I can mention that we'll provide a link or an access to these resources if you don't have them. These are all available on the WCS website, but perhaps at the end of the series, we can ensure that any useful resources are accessible to people here. So I want to dig a bit deeper into the nitty-gritty, into how here in this region, we're developing our site-based GRMs in the Central Africa region. This has been an ongoing effort from the site level up to the global level with SSMT and OGC, putting in place procedures and protocols, best practices, which can be generally adapted to all WCS sites around the globe. But of course, there'll be some adaptations, contextual adaptations according to what's happening in your location, for example, or the context at your site. And my colleagues will talk about that, our colleagues will talk about that in some of the following sessions. But the basic structure of the GRM that we're using here in Central Africa can also be used and standardized across other sites. So while this example comes from Okapi Wildlife Reserve in Eastern DRC, perhaps it can work for you too. And just a little bit on Okapi Wildlife Reserve, it's in Northeastern DRC. It's a reserve that allows people to live inside. I think there's around 30,000 people living inside the reserve itself. It's a complex site. We have management responsibilities along with the government. It's about 14,000 square kilometers of forested area. There are hunting zones, agricultural zones, all of those things that are being managed within the reserve. So a really great example of complexity when setting up grievance mechanisms. So prior to setting up a GRM, there's just some things that we like to consider. This is not an exhaustive list, but some key points. Considering local laws and regulations are very important, and even national laws on grievance redress or complaint management. In DRC, for example, there are national guidelines on GRMs. specifically for protected areas. So we have to, in DRC, align with those guidelines, but also consider local customs, traditional ways of handling complaints or grievances or even conflict. It's important to keep in mind that the GRM doesn't replace existing legal or court systems, although in some cases you might need to refer to them within the system. The second thing is collaboration with IPNLCs. When designing the GRM for Okapi Wildlife Reserve, for example, we held several focus groups, consultations, and community kind of meetings with community members, with men, women, Indigenous people, elderly, prior to putting anything at all in place, in order to get their insight on how the system should be set up, to get ideas about how they might feel most comfortable making submissions to the system, and who should be involved in the resolution process, et cetera. So this is really important to ensuring accessibility and even ownership and trust in how the system operates. Then there's, of course, awareness raising and sensitization. And this is both for staff and communities. Our staff need to know, what is a GRM? Who is it for? Why is it important? How can it be helpful to us? Communities need to know how to access it, what's eligible, what's not eligible in the mechanism, those types of things. And that sensitization is pretty continuous and ongoing. Then, of course, there's training and capacity building, again, both for staff and communities, and even partners that we work with. Everyone needs to know their roles and responsibilities, and that includes, at all levels of how we operate, from site directors or managers, country directors, regional directors. We also need to think about staffing to run the GRM. So how many staff we might need to run a system at a site. These are all considerations to think about before putting anything in place. And then finally, there's the evaluation, adaptation, and scale up. And in our sites in the Central Africa region, we've started mostly everything with pilots. So we have a few sites that are currently piloting. We have Okapi Wildlife Reserve that is starting to scale up, but we pick generally a few villages or locations that make sense to test the mechanism first. And then we see how it's going. We pause and reflect. We do meetings with the community. We check in with our technical team, Diane, with Diane and with Heidi, with OGC. We see, what's working well, what's not, and how we can improve. In Okapi Wildlife Reserve, just this month or last month in November, we did an internal evaluation, which included meetings with community members and focus group with staff to see how they felt and to get insight and feedback on how to improve the system as we grow it. I want to again point out that we do have some internal resources for this. For example, templates for focus group discussions, if you wanted to use them, or example job descriptions for GRM staff that could be available to other sites to adapt. Very quickly here is just the general steps of the GRM in Okapi and other sites in the region. There's the submission process, the review, analysis, categorization, then there's the information gathering or investigation, the resolution planning of the treatment, and then the resolution implementation. So if we go to our submission options in Okapi Wildlife Reserve currently, they're either available or in the works. You can submit in person, one-on-one. You can use a phone, SMS, text message. There's a hotline for the reserve that people can call and leave a message. There's suggestion boxes. We're starting to bring on board the process of community representatives, letter or mail, and of course, during community meetings and consultations, I'm sure you all know people like to bring grievances or complaints or concerns, and so that's another way. Once these concerns or grievances submissions are brought forth, whether that's in a suggestion box or a hotline, it's then entered using a standardized COBOL toolbox form to upload to the database. So for example, we have a suggestion box. Someone from the GRM team goes, they collect on a weekly basis, maybe, the submissions in the box. They use their COBOL toolbox form to enter the details of that submission. With the help of the amazing Diane, we've been able to create a pathway for the submission from COBOL toolbox automatically to the Asana database. So that happens automatically, and that can be used online or offline. And it's the same, for example, with the hotline. If someone calls the hotline, someone on the GRM team listens to the message, they use the COBOL form to make the submission, enter the details, it goes to the database. Same with in person or at a community meeting. It's the same way. And then once it's in the database, that's the first initial step of where it is starting to be processed. And the first real step is the grading and categorization. So on the left, you can see we have the grading here, and I hope it's not too small to see, but we have a grading of 0 to 5. And something that we've realized quite early on is that not all submissions come in the form of a complaint. For example, some people want to provide feedback or suggestions, or maybe they have a question about a project or asking for assistance. So we have those grades there, 0 and 1. And sometimes you might even find that a grievance comes in the form of a suggestion, and it's a grievance, but it's a suggestion. And I find that quite interesting. And so this is why we have these 0 to 5 categories, which basically give us the severity. So how severe is the submission? Is it a positive feedback? That's not very severe. There's no risk. It's actually great news. So that's the 0, all the way up to 5, where it's quite severe. There's a lot of sensitivity or confidentiality required. There could be safety risk or risk to community or staff members. And that is generally maybe a human rights violation or an alleged human rights violation. And so that would be categorized at grade 5. And then on the other side, we have more qualitative categorizations. And these can be somewhat tailored to your site or your project. In this region, we're using the ones listed here. And depending on the content of the submission, the team categorizes, for a human-wildlife conflict or something that's about a project, a specific project, illegal activity. And you'll see later, this is helpful in informing our programming and in how we can maybe build our proposals and future activities. Something really important to note about the automatic notifications, there's a helpful, what I consider an extremely helpful feature in our Asana database. And again, Diane helped us to set this up. We have automatic notifications for certain grades. So when a submission is graded by severity, there are some grades that get an automatic email sent out to staff that need to know about that specific case. And generally that staff is outside of the site in order to ensure proper support and also to ensure additional transparency, accountability, and in some ways, independence or unbiased perspective, I guess, on a submission that is particularly sensitive. So as you can see here, 0, 1, and 2, there are no automatic notifications. Those aren't particularly sensitive. There's no safety risk involved, and those are generally handled at the site level. No one else outside of the site really needs to know about them other than in summary or for informational purposes. For grade 3, that's a major dissatisfaction. That's how we qualify a grade 3. And so in our region, a grade 3, once it's graded, I get an email notification as the regional safeguards coordinator, as well as the national safeguards coordinator or manager for DRC. And that might look different in other country programs or regions where the staffing is different. But for a grade 3, I get an automatic notification, and it's not that it's it's necessary for me to come to the site or anything, but I can help the team in managing that more serious or more major, I guess, complaint. For 4 and 5, you can see here that that's when an automatic email is sent to both myself and the national manager, but also the country director, the regional director, the director of rights and communities, SSMT, that's Heidi, OGC, and the attorney for the region. And it's important to mention that prior to going live, prior to these notifications being set off, all the people on this list should be made aware that it's going live. They should know their role. If they are notified of an incident, what to do, what not to do. Sometimes this might require training of some sort or refresher training, meetings and calls about what it means to get a notification. And it's important for, you know, country and regional directors to be aware of the system and to support it. We really need the support of the regional director, the country directors, even the site managers about this notification system. And I want to stress again that it's a way to protect our staff in the field. And it's also, it's a way to add layers of support and accountability to the system and how it operates. So it brings some accountability to how we manage very sensitive grievances. This is just a screenshot example of a database as it appears after submissions are made through the COBO form. This is Asana database. Some of you may be familiar with Asana, using it for management. You can see that there's the inbox there. Once something is graded, it goes to the investigation phase, the resolution planning, and then eventually and hopefully closed and resolved. And I don't have it here, but within the Asana database, you can make notes or updates. You can have attachments, photographs, documentation as the submission moves through the system. I guess it should be noted that anyone who is using this system will have to have access to an Asana account to use it. So quickly, I want to just go through some of the more specific steps for information gathering. Once a submission is made, it's categorized, it's graded. It's almost always likely that more information will be needed. So the GRM team or the safeguards team are responsible for perhaps going to a person or a group who submitted and to collect more information about the submission. I want to stress as well that the GRM team or the safeguard staff, they're not conducting legal investigations. They're not police officers. They're just responsible for getting more information. And if it's a sensitive or serious, for example, 4 or 5, it's already out of their hands. And the primary responsibility for collecting more information comes from offsite and from a team of people who aren't connected to the site. So whether it's site-based team or external team, information gathering needs to be survivor-centered, meaning that the person who submitted is, you know, primary. We're thinking about them first. They determine the actions. They give consent. We want to have our consent best practices in place. We have to think about confidentiality and conflict sensitivity. Throughout the whole process, clear documentation and then uploading to the Asana database. And of course, as I mentioned, clear roles, GRM staff, not the police. They're there to get more information for us so we can resolve some of the less sensitive issues. And of course, everything is rights-based. We want to align our approach to ensure that it's a rights-based approach that is nationally recognized, internationally recognized, and as an institution, what we're striving for. And then, of course, there's resolution planning. After we have the information we need, that's when we can start to plan an action. And this is highly context or content dependent. If it's an issue about human-wildlife conflict, for example, you might need someone on that resolution team who knows about human-wildlife conflict. If it's about a very specific project, you might need the program manager or the project manager. If it's about management, you might need to bring in the park management. So it really depends. But again, this is a confidential process, should be participatory. Oftentimes you'll want to go back and forth with the person who submitted the issue and come up with a solution together. Ideally, it's timely, although some of those resolutions are difficult to resolve in a day. They might take several days or weeks for different reasons. And again, it's an iterative process. I should note as well that sometimes you might not come up with a resolution at all that is agreeable on both sides. And in that case, you may need to refer someone to another pathway, another option, whether that's legal or otherwise, that they can go to. And once a resolution is decided on, there needs to be continued implementation and follow-up. Again, some cases might be resolved in a day with a phone call. Other resolution plans might require longer term period. Again, with the example of human-wildlife conflict, can't be resolved in a day and may require a long-term strategy and specific attention. But again, clear documentation, accountable, transparent. The reporter should know and understand what the next steps are and when the next steps will happen, and those should be documented. So in the end, after all this work, and it is a lot of work to collect information, to do investigations, to come up with resolutions, what are some of the reasons why we do this? It's not just to tick a box. And I just wanted to go into a few examples of how our sites in the region are hoping to use this information and starting to use this information. And so here is an example of Okapi Wildlife Reserve and Kahuzi-Biega, two different sites, both in DRC. But you can see that in the submissions that they're receiving, they're quite different. It's interesting to me that in Kahuzi-Biega, most of the submissions are qualified as or classified as requests or questions. People have a lot of questions about the park, or they have requests about how to be involved, or requests about what the park can offer them. In Okapi Wildlife Reserve, currently the more submissions are about management, and that could be because, for example, in Okapi Wildlife Reserve, there are people living inside the reserve. As I mentioned, there's agricultural zones, hunting zones. So of course they might have a lot of submissions, grievances, concerns about management. Whereas in Kahuzi-Biega, people aren't living inside the park, they're living outside the park. They have a lot of questions. So the teams now are using this information to inform the programming. They're in Kahuzi-Biega, they're connecting this to their work plans for the new year. They're looking at these questions and requests, and they're saying, okay, how can we put this into a proposal? Or how can we incorporate this into our new activities to better serve the communities? They're telling us what they need, or they have questions about what they want. I also want to note that the safeguards and human rights percentages here are very, very low. There's a focus with GRMs on these high-risk submissions, and there's reason for that, because we do have to be concerned about human rights violations. But the majority of the submissions are general questions about what we're doing, or suggestions and ideas, or complaints about specific projects that aren't rights violations. They are just complaints. Like, everyone has complaints. We all are human and we have complaints. And these are the things that I think we want to continue to pay attention to. Otherwise, they won't even trust the system to use it for a human rights violation submission. So I just want to note that to you. The team in Okapi Wildlife Reserve recently put this map together after our internal evaluation last month. This is OWR, RFO in French, and they're working on analyzing the data by village. So currently there are 15 villages where the GRM is operating, and it may be hard to see, but those are the blue dots kind of lower center of the reserve. And I'd like to kind of go into the details per village of what we're dealing with here. So by submission type, we can see that suggestion boxes are popular options. They can be really convenient if you aren't able to make a submission in person, perhaps, or maybe the people feel more confidential by submitting in a box than doing a phone call. We can see here that the hotline right now is not widely used by the 15 active villages. And that could be because not everyone has phones, the network isn't great. There's a note there of other villages, and these other villages are submissions made where the GRM isn't officially running yet. And maybe they're using the hotline more because they don't have the access to suggestion boxes. And of course, with a phone line, you don't restrict where that goes to. So they're still using the system, but we haven't officially launched in those villages. Another interesting thing here to look at, and these are, again, just examples of how we can use this information. In Apulu, you see that we have a lot of in-person submissions, and that's where our headquarters are. So people are very easily able to go in person and make a submission. Here's the submissions by grade per village. And this can be helpful to identify hotspots, perhaps, in the villages where we're working in OWR. You can see here, if you look at Babama, there are quite a number of grade 3s. And to be honest, grade 3s are some of the complaints, those are the major dissatisfactions that are the hardest to resolve because they often require a lot of back and forth. They require some more intensive work and planning and resolution kind of discussions. And so if we look at Babama here, we can ask ourselves, what is going on in Babama? Why are there so many grade 3s? And how can we improve? What is the context here that's causing this level of dissatisfaction in this particular village? And then, of course, by classification. And this is a bit difficult to read as well, but here we can potentially look at other hotspots or trends in specific thematics by classification. And again, we can look at Babama. Most of the submissions there are related to management issues. So perhaps we need to target more engagement from the management level in that particular village to respond, at a higher level or more detailed level from the management to those grievances and those issues. And across the board, there's quite a lot of management submissions. And this is not surprising, again, considering the type of reserve or protected area that Okapi wildlife is. And it might be different in Kihuzi-Biega. We haven't done that analysis yet, but we hope to. Some challenges quickly, I'm almost done here. We can very easily in the database, the Asana database, using the COBOL form and the information that we collect, see clearly that accessibility is a challenge. So this is Kihuzi-Biega, and the submissions by gender, I guess that should be by sex. We can see that the majority is male, more males making submissions than females. The same goes for Indigenous people versus non-Indigenous people. We have more non-Indigenous people making submissions there than Indigenous people. So we can ask ourselves and the communities, we can go to them and say, what are the barriers for you to make a submission to the system? And what are the cultural barriers or the economic, educational barriers? And then how can we overcome them to bring wider accessibility? And so ideally, these numbers will improve over time. Some more challenges. It's important to talk about the challenges. Sensitization, I mentioned, both within staff and communities. We need our staff to be on board and to understand what the GRM is, why it's important, why all of that information I just showed you can be helpful to us in doing our work. And of course, communities need to be sensitized on, how the GRM operates, what it's for, how it can benefit them. Everyone needs to know their roles. I touched on this briefly, who does what, why, who doesn't do something is also important. The capacity, the GRM requires dedicated staff. In Okapi Wildlife Reserve, again, 30,000 people in the reserve alone. We need a team to manage that system. We can't just do it without a team. And then, of course, support to those staff members who are dealing with these complaints and dealing with potentially disgruntled beneficiaries or stakeholders on a daily basis. They need support from their coworkers and from global, from regional, in making sure that they have the support and help that they need to manage those things, but then also their own mental health as they're dealing with these difficulties on a daily basis. Building partnerships is extremely important. We aren't experts in everything. For example, we don't have a lot of gender experts at the moment in this region. And so building partnerships with local NGOs who work specifically in that field will be important to successfully mitigating grievances that deal with gender. Also working with government partners. I know that some of my colleagues, our colleagues, will be speaking on that in another series or another seminar. Human resources and safeguards overlap. This is a huge one that we're really noticing. There is an overlap between how human resources operates and safeguards. And it's important for staff, WCS staff, to know that the GRM is not for them, but we are accountable to it. So we may find that a submission is about some of our colleagues, some of our staff members. And while the GRM staff are, tasked to getting information perhaps about that, they're not the police. They're filling an important role. And a GRM system does make us all vulnerable to complaints, which is why we have to really collectively, be intentional about our approach to working with communities, with Indigenous people, and embracing, the core tenets of a human rights-based approach. There's a code of conduct that we've all signed as staff, and I really want to encourage our HR to give more trainings and implementation on what that means for our staff, so that we are viewed favorably and we bring positive changes to the places where we're working. And of course, we need management support as well, from the very top to the very bottom. It's not all challenging. There are some really great success stories, and I'm not going to read each of these, but I think it's important to see how this can be really helpful to us and to our communities. One of my favorite quotes here from a recent submission, or the resolution of the submission, is the one in the blue. It's good that we have a GRM system in OWR. Had it not been for the system that has enabled me to report my concerns, I'm sure I would not have received my chickens if the GRM team did not pay attention to my case. I urge you to continue providing linkages between OWR and the communities. This is a very basic example. Someone didn't get the chickens that they were supposed to receive, and now they have their chickens. And what a wonderful thing. We should be really proud and excited about that. Just quickly, the other one that I really enjoy as well is the one in the red. Your guidance in the resolution of this grievance has enabled us to progress peacefully. We managed to find the solution within ourselves as a community without relying fully on WCS. Thank you for your leadership. How amazing is that? We're building capacity within our communities to resolve conflict amongst themselves, and we're giving them that avenue to do so. And that's how we should be using and viewing our mechanisms as well. And so I'm just about done. And as this is the first presentation, I kind of want to pull it back a wider view again to where I started at the beginning with our global approach and best practices. So each site can have their own individual kind of mechanism. It's contextually based, but it can then feed back into the global system. And what you're looking at here is a snapshot, I think, from November 30th, so very recent, of the global Asana database. And so here are all the grievance mechanisms currently operational using this system, using the Asana system across our sites around the globe. I think there are currently 7, I believe. And just like at the site level, the global level can see and use this system to see as WCS how we're doing, where we need to improve. For example, the time to resolve grievances right now is not ideal. 14 weeks is definitely not ideal, and we can improve that. We can identify trends and hotspots, potential for specific programming from the global level down to the site level. And I think that's really exciting. And so before closing, I want to reiterate that what we are doing with this model and the potential that this system has to really inform us about how we're doing as an organization, how we can improve, answering these types of questions and coming up with the resolution indicates an effective GRM, an effective mechanism. And an effective mechanism can really contribute to a paradigm shift in how we as WCS are doing conservation around the world. And I also want to note that, you know, when I started as a consultant for WCS and I did a review of GRMs in the conservation sector, the examples that went beyond box checking, or at least that allowed me to dig a little deeper, were few and far between. So really, we have an opportunity here to be at the forefront of this. And while I know the thought of receiving complaints can be daunting and overwhelming, to me, it's very exciting. And I want to encourage you that it can also be exciting for you. We can be excited because it gives us the opportunity to improve our work, to improve our relations. And I would argue, honestly, that it will make us more effective in reaching our conservation goals. And so as a conservation organization, that's what we're trying to do. And that's all for me. Thank you. That it will make us more effective in reaching our conservation goals. And so as a conservation organization, that's what we're trying to do. And that's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Margit. I'm sure if the mutes were all off, you'd hear wild